Looks like we're recording now, so welcome to all the folks who are listening in to the recording as well. Again, I'm so excited to be a part of this Earth Month speaker series. I know we just turned the corner on a couple weeks past Earth Day, but really happy to be part of this wonderful, series of events put on at Cascadia. And just a little bit of background. So when we first started talking about what I should talk about, really, because there's a lot of different areas that kind of cross-cut environmental sustainability that I'm passionate about, and I'm sure a lot of you are passionate about as well. We first thought, oh, hey, why don't we talk about the nonprofit work that I've done in the past connected to food, health, and sustainability. And then through our conversations, the discussion sort of evolved. And so I'm here today to talk with you about kind of a more nuanced conversation related to sustainability in the food system that's going to look at collective impact across sectors. And we're going to look at a couple different industries and how within these industries in the food system, there are kind of active efforts to collaborate together to address a variety of different sustainability issues. So why don't we get started? I know as an audience member, I always appreciate knowing what's coming ahead. So this is a little overview of what I'm going to share with you today. And I hope we're able to engage in some conversation too throughout. So I'll give an introduction so you know who this sort of weird talking head is in the Zoom box. I would like for folks to participate in this opening activity that I'll introduce. Folks who are on Zoom, y'all can chat together. We have a couple of people in that situation. And then for folks who are in person, you're going to get to interact live. So that's always nice. And then I'm going to kind of talk more broadly about creating change in the food system as it relates to sustainability, and kind of present a couple useful frameworks that we can use in thinking about that. And then I'm going to kind of apply some of that thinking to some of my work that I've been doing in the coffee industry, the tea industry, and then more recently in farming in the US, which randomly enough has centered around tomato production. And then we'll talk about current and future opportunities and get to have more of an open discussion together. Okay, so that's where we're headed. I am currently teaching faculty at the University of Washington in the School of Public Health. Within this really unique program that's very interdisciplinary called Food Systems, Nutrition, and Health. But before I got into academia and became a professor, I worked in a variety of different spaces, all related to kind of environmental sustainability. So you can sort of see the first picture here looks like a pile of food waste, and that's because it is. My first job out of grad school, I was an environmental planner. Which meant in practice, I did a couple different things. I was working for the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. And so my first job there was actually calculating the recycling rate for the state of Massachusetts. So it obviously involved a lot of data collection, coordinating with towns and businesses and farmers in particular, because they were doing most of the composting. And then my second job was working more with businesses. And part of this was sort of a carrot approach, giving incentives to businesses and giving rewards and grants. And then another part of it was helping to enforce these waste bans that the state government had created. So that's a picture of a dump truck tipping a whole load of food waste from a commercial producer. And so what my job was at one point, I had a colleague I would go with, but we would essentially go to waste facilities and like inspect all of these trucks that were dumping materials. And if they had any material that was banned for disposal, we would essentially write them up a notice. We would find out sort of where the material came from. And then we would charge a fee to that company, whichever company had violated the ban. And we would also work with them on technical assistance. So you can see here, this was likely from like a large scale institution that has a cafeteria or something like that. And so they received, notice because they were disposing of perfectly good compostable food waste. So that's sort of phase one of my work in this space. Then I was really motivated to move to work more at a local level. So I got really inspired from this gardening project I was working at in Boston called the Food Project, where they were doing a lot of urban gardening, but sort of saw that there was this big opportunity for a lot of these burgeoning gardening programs that didn't have a cooking component. And so a friend of mine who was an educator at the time, we kind of sat together and came up with a curriculum and eventually launched a nonprofit called the Cookbook Project. And it was really based around using food culture as a lens for teaching young people about the connection between food, health, and the environment. And we did this initially through direct workshops. We were working with community-based organizations. We hosted workshops in 12 different countries and worked with a lot of great community organizations, and then eventually got funding to start a training program. So we trained a couple thousand food educators during the 10 years the organization was running, had so much fun, cooked so much food, ate so much food, learned a lot of really great recipes. And then the organization actually became part of a larger national nonprofit. So that happened kind of over the pandemic more recently. And then while I was running the Cookbook Project, I also started a PhD program. And the PhD program was focused on public health nutrition, but also food systems more broadly. And this is when I really got interested in the impact that food certifications and labels have across supply chains on various aspects of sustainability. So you can see pictured here, this was the first industry I ever worked in. I worked with coffee farmers in Guatemala and their global supply chain to try to better understand their experience as a fair trade certified organization and the various ways that fair trade has impacted their lives and livelihoods as it relates to sustainability. And that's kind of part of what we're going to be talking about today. So I went on to write a book about my research in coffee, and then I also did a similar study in tea. And that's, again, kind of what we'll talk about today. To get started, many of you who are interested in sustainability may have already seen kind of similar frameworks like this. This is a version of the 3 domains of sustainability, or 3 overlapping spheres of sustainability that I've adapted that kind of relates specifically to food systems and agriculture. And it kind of came out of my work learning from coffee farmers and tea farmers and farm workers in the United States. So I'll just kind of run through these. So of course, when people think about sustainability, we always think about environmental sustainability. That makes sense. It's sort of the largest and the most well-defined sphere. In terms of food and food systems, environmental sustainability really looks at 2 kind of larger buckets that have a vast array of sort of different components, but the 2 bigger buckets are the actual agricultural practices, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the case study I'll share, and then supply chain processes. So what happens on the farm, and then what happens once food leaves a farm and kind of enters the world. And then sort of the 2 spheres that are often sort of less discussed or sort of more poorly defined, there's like less agreement on what's included in these spheres, are the social sphere and the economic sphere. And the social sphere includes a lot. This is a more limited list that really pertains to food and food systems, especially for farmers. But I've encapsulated it as including health, so health and well-being, food security, equity and inclusion, human capabilities, so somebody's ability to kind of grow and learn and develop, and their capacity as a result of that. And then sort of tied to human capabilities is an individual's agency and then sort of collective empowerment. So the feeling people have of being able to actually create change in the systems in which they exist. Really important, right? And then we go to the economic sphere, which often people think of as just like you're making a good enough living, and that's fine. And I would say income stability is definitely one aspect of that. But autonomy, economic autonomy is another really important one. So looking at how financially independent someone is and how financially independent they're able to be. So it's not like a paycheck to paycheck situation. Diversification of one's livelihood. So if you just are making money through one sort of stream, especially if you're a farmer, if let's say just focusing on one crop, you're potentially at risk if something goes wrong with that crop. And particularly as it relates to climate change, that can be incredibly devastating if you don't have a diverse source of income streams. And then that ties into livelihoods as well. So how robust and supportive are sort of the series of livelihoods that someone has that provides them with economic stability. I also want to present the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which again are kind of boulders, so they're really big, but they're really great ways to frame and kind of operationalize achieving sustainability goals. And what's really interesting is a lot of farmer organizations, nonprofits, governments, and businesses have been adopting these goals as sort of a broader framework for conceptualizing how they're making progress on really important areas of sustainability in the social, the economic, and also the environmental spheres. So keep these two kind of frameworks in mind as we go through the case study, and we'll add one more in. I'd love you to think about, as I'm kind of presenting the different examples, how collaboration between sectors enables greater progress on some of these really deeply entrenched challenges. So if we look back really quickly at the UN Sustainability Development Goals, we've got huge boulders, right? No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. I mean, these are arguably like the grandest challenges that we face as a human civilization. And so it's not just going to be sort of one approach or one type of organization that's going to be able to address these issues, but really there's huge opportunities here for collectivity and collective impact in addressing some of these goals. And I know this sounds like kind of theoretical and you're like, yeah, this makes sense. But, you know, sort of where's the proof, where's the evidence? So I'm going to provide y'all with some examples from my research that I was really interested to learn about as I was working with coffee farmers and their coffee cooperative, tea farmers and their cooperative, and then farming organizations in the US. So just to give a little bit of background, the group I was working with in Guatemala, there were 8 different cooperative organizations that were connected to a larger federation. So each organization kind of ran somewhat independently, but then they were also members in this larger group. About 1/3 of the members were women, which is pretty rare in the coffee world, but is a trend that's been happening around the world, this kind of trend called the feminization of agriculture. So more and more women in agricultural communities are becoming involved for a variety of kind of complex reasons, which I'm not going to get too much into detail, but happy to talk about if people have an interest. So gender equality was definitely a huge piece of my research in that particular industry. And then we've got a case example from Sri Lanka. So I was working with a similar group. There were 4 tea cooperatives that were united under one federation. They were growing tea, but they were also growing a number of other products as well. A lot of spices, other vegetables, that type of thing. And the biggest focus with the Sri Lanka study was actually on environmental stewardship through certifications and kind of better understanding how the farmers thought of themselves as environmental stewards within the context of their work. They were not only farming organically to the USDA organic standard, but they also had a more advanced certification that's more similar to regenerative agriculture called biodynamic agriculture. So I'll talk a little bit about that in that case example too. And then finally, we've got the tomatoes in the United States. I think this farm grows things more than just tomatoes. They also grew cucumbers, some other hothouse vegetables. But this particular farm had a number of initiatives going, but I think what really stood out was their commitment to the UN sustainability goal around health and well-being. So a little bit of a precursor before we get into the details. And really the goal here is to kind of also show you what this looked like in each of the different settings. So another little overview of sort of who's all involved in creating the collective impact in each of these examples. We've got the farmers themselves, of course, who are working within their cooperatives and their federations, value chain partners. Often there were government agencies involved and other nonprofits. And then, of course, consumers play a really big role, and that includes all of us as folks who end up sort of as ethical consumers buying products that are produced using certifications like fair trade or like organic and other more environmentally related certifications. So the first example I'm going to share with you kind of focuses on the UN Sustainable Development Goal around gender equality, which is goal number 5. So again, this is like seems like a huge intractable issue. How can we begin to make progress on this? I think when we think about gender equality, it often feels like, are we even making progress? And so I'm really excited to share with you this example from my work in Guatemala. When I was in Guatemala, part of my research involved using a technique called photo voice, where I had participants take pictures of sort of important events and experiences and share them out. And this was a picture taken by one of the coffee farmers of it was a young women's leadership workshop that was on financial literacy and leadership. So it was like a training program for young women coffee farmers. Representatives were sort of given stipends to travel from all the different departments in Guatemala, and they came to the headquarters of the Federation for one day. It was like a really great coincidence because I happened to be there for sort of my first research stint, so I got to observe as well. And essentially, this workshop was put on by the cooperatives, the Federation. It was supported by the Fair Trade Foundation, which is a nonprofit, a training organization called We Affect, and then it had government support as well from a government-affiliated coffee industry group called Ana Café. So this is a really great example of how, like, while the work was situated and happening within the Federation that brought together these coffee cooperatives, it really was a collective impact effort. And so through the course of this workshop, women, they focused on sort of their financial reality, what their current situation is. They did planning for the future. And then they also went through a number of different kind of improv activities where in groups, they were sort of acting out different scenarios related to women's inclusion in professional capacities within the cooperative and also in their communities. So that's sort of what you're seeing here in this picture is sort of one of the kind of like acting out periods of a scenario. And so it was really through these types of workshops and others that the cooperative and the Federation were running that were sort of on a consistent basis, helping the members of the Federation, women and men, to sort of evolve in their self-awareness of sort of gender and gender norms in their community and in their sort of work environment, and to really be leaders in this area. So they were at that time undergoing an intensive strategy with their fair trade planning around gender sensitivity training and understanding the concept of toxic masculinity. So really fascinating. And honestly, in a lot of ways, like far advanced from a lot of workplaces I've seen operating in other places where you would expect that to be sort of the norm. Another example I'd like to share from Guatemala sort of encompasses 2 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So no poverty, again, huge goal, gigantic. And then decent work and economic growth. So these are really like systems level issues. And so what does it look like to actually address this at the level, within the food system, but then at the level of an individual, like a person working within the food system, a farmer, for example. So this is another photo that came out of that photo voice activity I was sharing with you about. This was a picture that this coffee farmer had taken of her and her two daughters in her coffee fields. And it represents, when she shared out in the focus group, it represents, not just the coffee farming she does, but she also produces saplings for sale that she sells. So when she's not selling her coffee harvest, she has another source of income in this region that really relies on coffee farming. And this particular work kind of embodies participation and collaboration between the Coffee Federation, the Fair Trade Foundation, and then the individual cooperative itself and other community development groups working at the local level to support women's livelihood diversification projects. There were so many great pictures that came out of this particular prompt. There was like a woman who took a picture of herself with her honey setup. So she had an apiary as like a side, not really a side hustle, but like another form of income generation. And there was another woman who was raising goats and selling milk and also making cheese and, at certain points selling goats as well for income. But this is one that is kind of more related to coffee that I thought I would share. So we've got two more examples, and then I'd love to take some questions from y'all before we sort of talk about the bigger picture. So this next example is from my work with the tea farmers in Sri Lanka. I mentioned that they were all operating under cooperatives that have a number of different organic certifications, one of them being biodynamic. And so this involved a couple different certification programs, fair trade as well, and then also the larger federation. So what you're seeing here in this picture is the federation's testing grounds for biodynamic practices. So being a farmer is a lot like being a scientist. You have to test and experiment, especially if you're adopting new agricultural practices, which is sort of one of the main areas where farmers individually and then collectively can make progress on sustainability issues in agriculture. And so this is a picture of that demonstration plot that shows a couple different, compost techniques that they're trying out. So in biodynamic agriculture, they focus on regenerating the soil. That's a really important component of their work. And so they're testing out sort of different formulations of composting, like solid material and also liquids as well. And this kind of exemplifies effort to achieving Sustainable Development Goal 12, which includes both responsible production, but also responsible consumption as well. So in theory, as consumers in buying these types of products, we're all playing a role in this also. And that's kind of where the power of the supply chain comes in as well. Okay, so the last example I'm going to share before we take some time for questions comes out of the most recent work I've been doing. So I'm hoping to publish the results of this research very soon with the first farm in the US to become fair trade certified. So I'm curious, how many folks out there have heard of fair trade?
Almost everyone's raising their hand.
Almost everyone. Okay, awesome. And when most people think about fair trade, they think about farmers in other places producing bananas, coffee, tea, chocolate. These are kind of the main goods that we associate with fair trade. But a really interesting thing happened in the fair trade movement in 2012. Conversation started, and then 2015 there was a division between two large fair trade organizations in the fair trade movement. Fair Trade International, which is mostly represented kind of by Europe, and then Fair Trade USA, which is currently based in Oakland. And so at the time, there was sort of this larger philosophical shift where Fair Trade USA decided we don't just want to certify smallholder farmers and smallholder farmers who are members of cooperatives, because this was sort of the focus of Fair Trade International, but we also want to certify larger scale farms. And so this was pretty controversial for Fair Trade International, still very controversial within the world of fair trade practitioners and policymakers and academics, all kinds of folks. But sort of the reasoning behind Fair Trade USA's shift was like, fair trade represents 2% of the market, essentially. And we've got this other 98% of food and products being produced where fair trade isn't being applied. So in order to be able to address this other larger sector, they felt like they needed to expand the purview of their work. And so in 2015, that split happened. And in 2017, Fair Trade USA started certifying farms in the US. So it's pretty rare in the US that you have smallholders operating independently or in the context of a cooperative. Many more of the farms are sort of larger scale farm operations with many, many thousands of farm workers. And for those of you who are students of labor studies, farm workers in the US are in an extremely precarious position. Up to 70%, it's estimated that up to 70% of farm workers in the US are immigrants, and many of those folks are undocumented. And so they end up being extremely vulnerable to health issues, environmental exposures, all kinds of dysfunction within the context of agricultural production. So I was really curious to see, how is fair trade being implemented in the US, and how is this making a difference, particularly for the health and well-being of farm workers? And so this slide kind of represents the effort of Fair Trade USA to address the health and well-being of farm workers. And so what I found through my research, conducting interviews with the Fair Trade Committee, which is comprised of democratically elected farm workers, and then conducting surveys with farm workers. And by the way, this happened all over the pandemic, so it was extra complicated. And the farm was actually even busier than normal because of supply chain issues. What I discovered in particular, somewhat through the surveys, but especially in talking to the Fair Trade Committee, was around some of the mechanisms that fair trade provides for supporting health and well-being for farm workers. And a key aspect of that is actually just creating this democratic governance structure. So farm workers are given a voice and decision-making power through the context of this committee. So they elect their peers to the committee. And then the committee helps the sort of collective of farm workers employed collaborate to make decisions around how they're going to spend their fair trade premium. So a big part of the benefit of fair trade for producer organizations and for farmers is that on an annual basis, in addition to getting more money per pound than the market standard for whatever it is they're producing, they also get fair trade premiums. And the fair trade premiums come through a nonprofit mechanism back to the farm or the cooperative. And it's basically money that they get to decide how to use. And so what I heard from the Fair Trade Committee here on a couple of their projects was that on one front, they were able to use funds to support healthcare access and subsidize healthcare for farm workers. They were also able to create food security initiatives, like a cooperatively run grocery store that was on site. And then another very popular initiative, wasn't that popular with everyone at first, but has become popular, was constructing a football or soccer field for the community. So that was kind of a more costly project that there was some tension around, but overall, folks relayed that the decision to do that was really powerful because it not only provided an activity space for physical activities, so to play sports, but it provided a really important sort of social network for people in the community who might have otherwise felt isolated or sort of confined in their job and in perhaps their immigration status, to kind of come together in a more sort of celebratory way and create social ties that we know are really important for health and well-being. So really surprising and exciting findings from that initial research that I'm hoping to kind of continue into more deeply. So those are the examples that I have to share with you. And I'm going to pull up the kind of placeholder slide of the UN SDGs to pause for a moment to see if folks have questions. If you have questions about the subject, if you want to learn more about any of the research or projects, I'm happy to answer those now. And then we can kind of talk about the future.
Okay, I was asking about a more sustainable option than coffee that is local, like a local plant. I know that like mate, yapon, and there's other options besides, shipping our coffee from around the world. Could you share some of those local sustainable systems or alternatives?
Yeah, well, my research isn't really oriented around that, just to be frank with you. I've, spent a lot of time working in the coffee industry. So I will say that when we think about sustainability, and there's actually more research that's come out about this recently, local is important and is definitely one factor, but it's not the only indicator of environmental sustainability, especially as we look at the way our sort of global food system is set up. So a lot of it depends not just on sort of where it's from, but how it's produced. And that relates to environmentally how it's produced and how it impacts people as well, of course. So important sort of bigger picture issues to think about. I don't think the solution right now is for everybody to sort of look and see if there's a caffeinated beverage in their local area and switch to that. I think what is interesting to think about are opportunities to support and enhance sustainability in the major industries where there's huge consumer demand. So coffee is a huge industry. It produces almost as much value by like financial impact as oil. So it's like third to crude oil in terms of its export value. So well, on an individual level, if you prefer not to drink coffee, that's fine. But I think ignoring coffee as an industry would definitely be ignoring a huge opportunity to create sustainable livelihoods, to create sustainable options for like the millions of people who do consume coffee, and also tea, I should say, because tea is the most sipped beverage next to water in the world. So I think it's less of a question of local substitution and more of a question of really thinking intentionally about how we can use these industries to kind of transform previously unsustainable practices. I'm not sure we're gonna get rid of coffee unless climate change kind of does that for us. But I'm tuned into a lot of the coffee industry research and discussion, and actually coffee farmers in East Africa have been implementing a lot of really important climate adaptive practices. And one of them is sort of introducing climate adapted coffee plants. So sometimes you might see these sort of articles like we're not going to be able to drink coffee. We have to switch to local options. But actually, humans are pretty smart and inventive. And especially if you're a poor coffee farmer in Tanzania and you're relying on coffee for your livelihood to support your family, you're gonna, try to continue that work, of course. And so there's this new type of coffee that's more climate resilient. It's Liberia varietal. So currently Robusta and Arabica are kind of the most dominant. Arabica is sort of the specialty coffee. And Robusta is more of like the volume produced coffee. But Liberia appears to be surviving and thriving amidst changing weather patterns, changing rainfall, all of these issues that farmers are confronting. Any other questions that folks have?
Alissa, I have a question actually. I read recently Dr. Bronner's book, and they're actually trying to push Fair for Life certification rather than fair trade. Do you know much about that and the differences of them?
Yeah, there's probably 24 different fair trade oriented certifications. So the fair trade movement is a broader movement that encapsulates many different organizations, nonprofits, for-profits, certification organizations. And so Fair for Life is kind of one variety. I've specialized more specifically in Fair Trade International standards and Fair Trade USA standards. Those are kind of the two dominant ones, I would say, and the ones that are extremely detailed. So I recently did an audit of Fair Trade USA's US Farm Addendum. So it's like a 60-page document that adds on to their current standard, going into extreme detail, point by point, referencing, United Nations human rights declarations, various levels of government enforcement of laws, and also best practices in different areas. So from my experience researching the standards, I would say Fair Trade International and Fair Trade USA are definitely the biggest and the most well-defined in terms of their certification standards. Fair for Life you see every now and again, but I'd be curious to learn also from your experience reading the book of what you sort of why Dr. Bronner's felt like that was the standard they wanted to go with.
At least from reading the book in the Dr. Bronner's book, the Fair for Life certification tracks the supply chain. So it's fair trade treatment of supply chain workers along the pathway as well, is what they were going after. So that even people processing the foods and shipping the foods were being paid fair wages and not being mistreated was the goal. And I think that's why they chose that one.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I know with Fair Trade International and Fair Trade USA, they certify at a couple different levels. So a producer will be certified, but then other folks along the supply chain will be certified as well. So up to the retailer, for example. But it sounds like maybe Fair for Life, it's like a one-stop shop, and then you know that the whole supply chain is verified through that. In Fair Trade USA and Fair Trade International, a producer has to go through a separate certification process. A supplier has to go through a separate, like distinct certification process and sort of on through the system. Dr. Bronner's is actually, I think, the founder of that business. He's on the board of the new regenerative organic certification, which I'll actually talk about at the end when we're kind of wrapping up, but really has been like at the forefront of driving the integration of a lot of sustainability certifications into food, and also, I guess, Bronner's is technically like in the body care industry.
Okay, one more question.
There are just a lot of certifications out there. So there's fair trade, there's regenerative organic, there's regular organic, there's Rainforest Alliance. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So if you're looking for a product and you're in the grocery store and you're like standing on a shelf and looking at all these different certified products, like what should be my decision? Which one should I choose, and why?
That's a great question. I always get this question.
Yeah.
And it's important, right? It's like, as consumers, we face like death by 1,000 certifications. You're just trying to buy tomatoes and you have so many choices. And I think that's sort of like a separate and really interesting conversation, is just like the proliferation of choice for consumers in the grocery store setting, right? Like you try to buy any one thing and there's like 20 different options. So that's like baseline without even considering consumer awareness around certification. Y'all are obviously ahead of the game and are probably reading labels, doing all the things. This is sort of what we call the rise of the ethical consumer, informed consumers who are specifically buying products with an intention of creating some change through their purchase, right? So I'll just tell you what I do. I mean, I think everybody kind of like, as you develop your own priorities and also acknowledge like the boundaries in which you're making food choices, which obviously includes your budget as well, other family and friends that you're sharing food with. Those are important considerations too. I always look for, I like to see some sort of organic label first and foremost. That's like the biggest priority, because by buying something that's certified organic or some other variety of that, you are protecting the earth, you are protecting the farmer who's not exposed to pesticides. You are also protecting yourself as a consumer. So I think that's like a good first point. And then if it's also fair trade certified, I'll grab it. If it's between an option that's fair trade or non-fair trade, if it's within my budget, I'll definitely get the fair trade. I mean, I think ultimately, like for most consumers, it does come down to that critical question of budget. And that is also a source of privilege, right? But if you do have the ability in certain circumstances to make those choices, I would say some version of organic, some version of fair trade kind of helps you to span the sort of 3 dimensions of sustainability. But then I also want to share, like, consumers, it's complicated, right? We're not gonna simplify the consumer market anytime soon. But what's really interesting and what I found through my research are the ways that the certifications are being used by businesses at all levels of the food system. So farms and farmers operate as businesses, and I'm including them in this conversation. I've seen through my research and through others' research that the certifications are being used like at a business level as environmental and social impact tools. And so even though it's like pretty confusing for consumers now, businesses are using certifications as building blocks and like operational management tools to improve how they're doing work in these areas, in the environmental sphere, in the social sphere, in the economic sphere. And this is no longer just sort of voluntary practice, but in many situations and in many industry contexts, they're required to meet certain standards, and there's certain reporting requirements as well. And it's also being used as a risk management tool, and this is like an unintended consequence for retailers who are trying to reduce their risk of like getting involved in a scandal. And so on the one hand, like not the intention we necessarily want to see as consumers. Like we want the businesses we support to be inherently, have these values of sustainability inherently woven in their business practices. But many businesses are just trying to cover their butts and like make sure they're not doing anything illegal. And so like in the case of chocolate, for example, or even tomatoes in the US context, when there are labor violations that are exposed in those industries, big retailers come under fire. And so by ensuring that their supply chains are certified through, various certifications that are designated under the fair trade movement, they're able to point to kind of the transparency of the supply chain and verify what kinds of practices are happening, improve like child labor isn't happening in our cocoa supply chain, or sexual harassment isn't happening in our tomato supply chain. So it's really interesting also to think about it from the business perspective too. Okay, while we're at a pause, I'm happy to take more questions if there are any. Okay, so I just want to kind of wrap things up a little bit. And again, maybe this will prompt 1 or 2 more questions as we wrap up. So overall, what are kind of some future trends and opportunities? And y'all were sort of getting at this with some of your questions, but I would say from the research I've been doing, focused in these particular industries, in coffee, in tea, and then in a couple different ag environments in the US. One big insight has been sort of the importance of agricultural institutions. So when we went through all those examples of how different groups were sort of addressing these big, bolder issues, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, responsible production, and then also health and well-being. It was really like the core organizations that, in this case, within agriculture, that farmers are members of. So the cooperative organizations that give farmers more power in all senses of the term. And then the federations that unite the cooperatives that allow a lot of this collective impact work to happen. So they provide the infrastructure for not only just for creating better market access for farmers, but more importantly, for creating all of these sort of development and capacity building opportunities as well. Access to financial resources. That's huge. I could keep going. So that's like a really important insight about the importance of these institutions and how they're also connected to other support structures. Certifications, obviously, we've been talking about this quite a bit. And I think what's interesting in this space, the question we just got was kind of about the proliferation of certifications. And again, for consumers, this is like kind of a huge mess. But what's really fascinating to see is how new certifications are evolving using previous certifications as sort of their baseline standard. So I'll give you an example. The Certified B Corporation is a new one that you may have seen on packages, anything from like a bag of coffee to a pair of jeans. And Certified B is a corporate certification for businesses, and it's also an environmental and social governance management system that helps businesses track how they're meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that platform is incredibly powerful, and it's built upon the foundation of all of these myriad certifications. So for like baseline reporting, they use FSC certified, they use Rainforest Alliance, like companies go through the sort of audit system. And if they've received these other certifications, it kind of automates them into a certain level. So it's really fascinating to watch the certification space evolve and really, I think, encourage businesses and organizations to go deeper. So B certified is primarily a business certification, but their platform can be used by other types of institutions and organizations. So Cascadia, for example, as a university or a college could sign up for their UN SDG tracker and track how the university as an institution is meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that's something I think is really cool. And like some other examples, direct trade is really built on the fair trade model, but kind of going further. Regenerative organic, which again, Doc Bronner's is a big supporter of, is building on organic, but going further. So it's really fascinating to witness the sort of evolution of the use of these certifications to create, more improvements in the sustainability space. And then finally, something that I saw from an industry perspective that was really important that we don't always think about as consumers. Like maybe we think about the farmer, but I think that's as far as we often get if we're sort of informed consumers. But what I saw through my research was the important sort of reinforcing shared values of a particular value chain. So within the context of the coffee farmers I was working with in Guatemala, their exporters, their importers, their retailers, their roasters that they were working with all across the US, Europe, Asia, all were aligned, and they were a part of my research, all were aligned in their values around sustainability, gender equality, all of these different things. So I think that's a really powerful part of this work, is that it's not just a group of farmers kind of like pushing ahead in this huge market, but there's actually these sort of systems of collaboration and cooperation happening across supply chains. Now, this is like a very sort of rosy view, and my research inherently is looking to better understand how people are working together to create positive change. So it doesn't necessarily focus on some of the challenges there, but there are definitely many. So I just want to put that in as a caveat, and I'm sure y'all have been thinking about some of those as well. Happy to talk about that. Happy to take any other questions that you might have. But otherwise, I'm also open to email. So if you're interested, if you want to talk, I'm based in Seattle. If you would like to grab coffee also, I'm often open to that for folks who are willing to make the effort, but otherwise happy to answer a question or two while we still have a little bit of time.
No, I guess not. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Alissa. I appreciate your time.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks for hosting me. It was a lot of fun. Love talking about coffee and tea and all those things related to sustainability in the food system. So yeah, thanks for inviting me and including me as a part of the series. I really appreciate it.